I cringe for multiple reasons because I'm so disappointed, like I cringe at medicine, that was accepted practice that you can only learn and teach people by humiliation. I cringe at myself for accepting it, like, from being in a position of with having so little power that it was, or the perception of having so little power.
Welcome back to another episode of the podcast for Doctors by Doctors. I'm Dr. Michael Jerkins, your host. And actually today, I don't have a co-host. Technically, I have a guest. That is Dr. Ned Palmer. Very excited to be able to interview him. He has no idea what questions I'm going to be asking him. We've spent a lot of time together over the years, both as co-residents and co-founders. But I tried to change it up and ask him some things that I don't know the answer to. But if you don't know much about Ned, you will after today. Not only is he a physician, but as a world traveler, pilot, he's sailed across the Atlantic. He does all these really interesting things. And in contrast, I'm one of the most boring, basic people. So it's a nice combination, I think, of personalities. But Dr. Palmer is also a medical ethicist. But I'm very excited to get to talk to him and also hear a little bit more about his story as a medical trainee and going through the match and in residency and how all of that was and his views on certain things related to topics that are hot topics in healthcare and in medical education today. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome our guest, Dr. Ned Palmer. Well, we are excited. I actually had ChatGPT write this intro for Dr. Ned Palmer because I felt like I was going to be biased, but let me just read it for you guys. We have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Ned Palmer to the podcast. Dr. Palmer is a distinguished physician and entrepreneur, currently serving as the Chief Operating Officer and co-founder of Panacea Financial. That sounds cool. A company dedicated to providing tailored financial services to doctors. Dr. Palmer earned his Doctor of Medicine degree from Ross University School of Medicine, followed by a residency at the University of Cincinnati Medical Center and Cincinnati Children's Hospital. He further specialized by completing a fellowship in global health and obtaining a Master's of Public Health in Global Health from the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. How's it going so far? Is it accurate?
Really good. Way nicer than any other intro you've given me before. So far.
Currently, Dr. Palmer practices as a hospitalist in Boston and Montana and holds a faculty position at a school in Boston that I won't say. In addition to his medical practice, Dr. Palmer co-founded Panacea Financial to address unique financial challenges faced by doctors. His personal experiences with financial struggles during medical training inspired him to create a better banking and financial solution for doctors and doctors in training. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Ned Palmer. What an honor to have you here today.
Thank you, Dr. Jerkins. This is the only time I've been described as distinguished ever. I got to know, what prompt did you put in? I'm going to flip it and interview you starting there.
Nope, that's not how this goes. Dr. Palmer. Let me just dive in here, okay? Let's give the audience what they want. Questions for you. What is something about doctors that most people get wrong?
So I've come to a realization lately about what a lot of people get wrong about doctors. And I think it's the idea of when our time is protected. It's something that took me a long time to understand. A lot of people have heard about the federal work hours restrictions for residents, right? Or heard of them and things like that. What I think few people realize is that's the only time in a decade of your healthcare training where your time's actually protected. I think about our own training. It was only during the 4 years we were residents together that you actually have any time protections, and that before then, as a student, and then after then, typically as a fellow or as practicing attending, you actually have no work hours restrictions, and the hours actually go up on either side. So I think that's something that in kind of talking to people recently is something that I think most people don't get, and I think a lot of even trainees don't necessarily understand that that's kind of the expected life cycle. I loved it, but it is something that you kind of had to know going into it.
So are you saying that most people don't realize that your hours are protected in residency?
I'm saying most people don't realize that your hours are only protected in residency. A lot of people have heard of the residency work hour restrictions, even people who don't work in medicine, they've heard of these things. I mean, they've been in place now for 30 plus years and, they come up pretty frequently. I think what people don't realize is that's the only time in your career where those protections play in. So in school, often in fellowship, as an attending, you don't have those kind of work hour protections in place. Um, yep. Yeah. That's something that's come up more recently. I know that's very, very specific, but
Well, there was recently this idea floated that doctors, talking about time, should be mandated to practice 15 years full-time practice after training or face some sort of financial penalty. What do you think about that?
15, 1-5.
1 5 15 full-time.
Oh, I did not even know that that was floated. I mean, is there, I mean, I think nothing but negative thoughts about that because physicians can do so many things with the training that's in front of them. So, what do we define as acceptable practice right off the bat, right? You know, I'm going to argue this as an internist, which is I'm going to chip away at the roots of that, of how did you set up this question and what are the definitions you're using and what are the terms that you're using? What's acceptable clinical practice? Could you go work in novel drug development? Could you go work for a biotech or an entrepreneurship like we have? Do you have to support patients? Do you have to support other doctors? What if 10 years in, you're offered a job as the CEO of a hospital, but that doesn't qualify because you're not practicing clinically anymore and you've gone administrative? Do you then, and then what are you penalized for? Is this jail time? I think we should absolutely impose jail time with this. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny because, like, right, what if you go work for an insurance company? You're not working clinically. That's its own
Sure.
career. Does that not count? And
Yeah.
what is the penalty? It was something that I heard, and I would have to read this. It was a tweet. Okay, so I'm not acting like this was the. It was a congressman who is a physician, though, and it was something like they have to pay back the benefit the government gave them to go to medical school. I'm like, that's called a loan, and that is what I was paying off.
7.3% interest I'm already paying on the
Yeah. I mean, I get, like, what I like about it is at least there's some creative thinking about, like, what can we do for the workforce, but the idea is just not maybe as sound as.
I like your optimism, even though I hate everything about that recommendation. I think, look, if you peel that back, that's somebody badly misunderstanding CMS's role and how residents generate value for hospitals, right? Like, if you want to say that only paying us $50,000 and you know we should pay back the extra money CMS gave to the hospital to train us, I think that's an insane statement, right? If every year the hospital makes on average, what is it, $250,000 or something to train a resident? Very complex accounting there, and you could have a lot of arguments about where the financial flows are going. They're definitely not going to the trainee though, so let's not pretend like they're the one getting to carry all that wealth with them through time.
Tell us about your medical education journey.
I think ChatGPT did a great job. I don't have any other. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah. So I was a second career physician. I worked for a couple years as a research chemist and in chemical engineering, and then I realized that really I needed something that was more connected to humans, more for me, and so kind of switched careers. I was on a very very stable, comfortable career path there at the time. Um, One sec. Hello. The movers are coming right now. Sorry. Yeah. Another time would be great.
I hope we don't edit that out.
No, let's keep that. Everything's going exactly as I planned today. That is, if there's one takeaway from today, this tightly constructed, logistically nightmarish day is going perfect.
So you had a second career. That's what you were telling us.
Second career physician. I am a second career physician now, maybe a third career, depending on what we're doing, how we call this today, Dr. Jerkins. But I was a second career physician. As a second career physician, I had to take a good look at myself and decide, how do I get ready to go to med school? Am I going to look at a post-bac program, or am I going alternate training route? And I went the alternate training route. So I went to the Caribbean, to a Caribbean MD school, Ross University School of Medicine in Dominica at the time. 4 years there, where I fell in love with med peds. Ultimately selected that as a specialty. Joined you in Cincinnati, where we first met in our internship in med peds, and then well in med peds, really in our med peds residency, really. Became enamored with global health and international health delivery. And so went on and did my fellowship there at a school in Boston that you don't like to name. So
No, it's not. I don't like to. It's not true. I think it's funny.
I mean, at every step, I would say maybe, I don't know if this was your feeling, but I did not plan more than the next step ahead of me. I did not start med school knowing I was going to global health. I didn't even start med school knowing med peds existed. I went into med school pluripotent, let's say. I had no idea what I was going to be and completely undifferentiated.
I will count that as the first time someone on this podcast has used the word pluripotent. So congratulations on that. I did want to ask you, what parts of your medical education now seem obsolete?
Histology, now that I just immediately mentioned stem cells. Histology and microscope slides, as much as it pains me to say, I distinctly remember being tested on pink and blue slides, what different types of staining mechanisms you should use, distinctly obsolete. I think there's a lot of way in which, so outside of that one very specifically, I think there's a lot of ways in which our med school was trained, which was very much subject based and not patient focused. And so I trained, it was probably the last gasp of that model of you had pharmacology courses and you had anatomy courses and you had physiology courses, instead of where I see a lot of med schools have changed to of like you have systems based training. I'm not sure where yours was, but even the school that I went to has now changed to like here's cardiology, here's the drugs that impact cardiology, here's the anatomy of the cardiac system, there's a physiology of how it works, here are disease states associated with it. Still don't know if that's ideal, but it's at least putting the human at the middle of it, in the middle of it, or at least a human piece of anatomy in the middle of it that I see has been like a really substantial change over the last probably 10, 15 years in medical education.
Yeah, that was my experience too. Actually, I think I was there when our school transitioned from the subject kind of, divisions versus the more systems based. Let me ask you this. How much debt, if you're comfortable talking about this, which I actually already know you are, so that's why I'm asking.
Yeah.
How much debt did you have from your medical education?
Yeah, so I accumulated $320,000 of debt on the day that I graduated. It was pretty much exactly $320,000 on the day that I graduated. I then went and did 6 years of postgraduate training, 4 years in residency, and 2 years in fellowship, during which time I continued to accumulate interest on that debt at a weighted average interest rate of 7.3%. So I added $100,000 worth of interest to my student loan debt by the time I graduated from fellowship and got my first like adult doctor job. So all in, I would consider that all in. It was $411,000 by the day that I left fellowship.
Is that how much debt you expected to incur at the outset of your training?
No, I expected half of that.
Really?
Part of that is, when I was looking at going to med school was probably a solid 15, 18 years ago. And then every year the tuition rates go up stratospherically. Every year when I was going through along the same timeline you were, every year the interest rates were rising or they were peeling back protections that had previously been there on the interest rates. And so I unfortunately caught it on the bad end of an investment curve, and it really ballooned the costs. I will also say that oftentimes when numbers are reported, they don't include what happens to you during residency or almost never. They talk about maybe $300,000. Sure, I left med school with $300,000, $320,000. That was more than I thought. I'd maybe gone in thinking 250,000. But then what? Like everybody has to go into a training program to be a practicing doctor. And there, with the SAVE program, it was the first plan that actually addressed the fact that interest accumulates way faster than you could pay it off. And now that plan's already has an injunction against it and is probably going away. And so I think we're already back to kind of the bad old days where you have to factor in how much ground you're going to lose during residency and during your training programs. It's not a problem. As a physician, you can absolutely meet the needs of your student loans, but I think it's going in eyes wide open is really important to make sure everybody else is doing better math than I did.
Well, let's say you could go eyes wide open into your training, knowing exactly how much debt you would have by the end of your training. What is the number that you would have said, nope, I'm not doing this?
Probably $500,000 or $600,000.
What about back then?
Back then, if you told me $500,000 or $600,000, I don't know if I would have walked away because I had no concept for how much money that was. That's the problem, right? It's if you told me $500,000 at that stage in my life, I'd never spent anywhere close to that much money, or like I didn't own a house at the time. I never even made any purchase that had that same number of numbers. I wasn't even operating in that universe. So there is an intangible component to it of how do you make it real for you to make that decision? Yeah, it was. every car I'd bought at that point was worth less than $10,000. So I don't know, give me 50 of those, and
Maybe it would have
maybe
been okay.
maybe that would have been helped me understand it.
And you'd gone back to the lab, I guess, huh? The chemistry lab?
Something along those lines. Yeah, I probably would have pursued a career in academic science.
Let me ask you this. Tell us about your match day story as much as you want to say about it. And maybe with that, give a little bit of context of how it works for those people listening that don't understand how the match works.
So the match, and especially the main residency match, occurs in the third week of March pretty much every year. It's where over 90% of medical students find out where they're going to be going for their residency program. They're not just finding out what city and state they're going to, they're also actually finding out what residency they've matched into, and frankly, where their future is. Almost, if we extend that out, 80% of doctors practice within 100, within 100 miles of where their residency program is. And so it really, for the first couple of years of where their first jobs are, so it's not just what you're matching into, it really sets a path for your life, both geographically and from a professional standpoint in terms of what you're going to learn. It's an incredible moment. It's this massive emotional thing that every fourth year medical student goes through as they get into residency. The way that they're dealt with at different schools is very differently. Now, I don't know the American medical school experience, but I've heard about it, of course. In the Caribbean medical schools don't get advance notice of where their students match. And so the schools aren't prepared, and there's really no way for them to do any kind of ceremony or preparation or anything. So, as a Caribbean medical graduate, I stood around in the library refreshing my Gmail, waiting for an email to come in at 12 o'clock Eastern on March 17th. And that was when and where I found out that I was going to Cincinnati. We had room temperature Fago because it was Michigan, and room temperature Jets pizza that everybody was so nervous, really nobody would eat or drink any of it. Well, they waited around, and it was a very interestingly isolating experience because every person individually was doing the same thing and just refreshing Gmail over and over again. And then somebody would get an email and they'd squeal or cry or have some emotional response. But everybody else was so focused on what they were doing. It was a lot of parallel play that day to bring in some pediatric language of everybody really on their own path. But massive amounts of emotions, good, bad, and ugly. We saw all of them play out. I was thrilled. Cincinnati was one of my top choices. I was absolutely thrilled to see that I was going to Cincinnati for med peds. But it was really hard being right next to people watching them go through something that maybe they weren't as lucky as I was.
Yeah, that's difficult. What is one thing you look back on your medical training and cringe thinking about still?
So this is a real answer, but it's so embarrassing. It was one of the first times I got just dressed down by a surgeon in the OR because I didn't know the layers of the abdominal wall during a surgery. I couldn't come up with them immediately and to a measure that he liked. And then I broke scrub and then a scrub. Say all in the same procedure. And then I broke scrub and a scrub tech yelled at me. And I think I went to the stairwell and cried. And that was, and I cringe for multiple reasons because I'm so disappointed. I cringe at medicine that was accepted practice that you can only learn and teach people by humiliation. I cringe at myself for accepting it, from being in a position of with having so little power that it was, or the perception of having so little power. That absolutely, I still reflect on that. Middle of the night, I'll be like, I'm still embarrassed that I did that, and it's not great.
I think we all have those stories, especially in medical training. Maybe I think I probably have more than you do, but this is your interview.
Why do you have more than I do?
Well, yeah, I don't know. That's for a different episode. You're one thing about you, if people don't know, you're a student of history. So, question to you is, who do you think the real father of medicine is? Is it Osler? Is it Hippocrates?
Oof.
Who would you consider the real father of medicine?
Can I ask a clarifying question, or do I just have to give an answer right now?
Sure. I'll just make it up. Yeah. What's your question?
You said the father of medicine or father of modern medicine?
See, I didn't specify that.
Father of medicine, I'd go way back to Hippocrates because he originally tried to lay out what a physician's duty was, what was the patient's responsibility, the physician's responsibility, society's responsibility to sick people. Like it was really, there's a reason we still take the Hippocratic Oath because it was groundbreaking writing at the time about what everybody's responsibility was, kind of this like tripartite responsibility. Now, Hippocrates also said physicians will not take money for the treatment of medicine. And so, what's his involvement with modern medicine and the $4 trillion that changes hands in healthcare every year in the United States alone? It's a different question.
Would he call us hypocrites?
He might, perhaps ironically. Um,
Had to. It was a softball.
it was, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Maybe that was the whole setup, actually. I was playing 3D chess just then. Let me ask you this, Ned. As I was doing my research on you to try to better understand and ask these questions, I noticed online Ned Palmer has written a book that I'm really interested in. I'd love to hear you talk about this more because you have such wide tastes in your activities and interests. It's called A Cheesemonger's History of the British Isles by Ned Palmer. Tell us about that.
So, if you haven't been cheesemongering in the British Isles, I could not recommend it highly enough. And if you're going, pick up the book. It is the definitive guide, a distinguished guide, even some might say, some ChatGPT models might say, about how to cheese your way through the British Isles.
Wait. Oh, it's a different Ned Palmer. I'm so sorry.
I don't think that that's true at all.
Sorry. If you Google Ned Palmer cheesemonger, it turns out that it doesn't look like you. But my mistake. I am still learning this whole interview thing.
Okay. It's a pseudonym that I write under, actually. Like Mark Twain, like his
Yeah.
real name was also Mark Twain. He just pretended it was a pseudonym.
Let me ask you this. What is the last up-to-date article you had to read for patient care?
Acute diverticulitis in the inpatient setting. Just about 5 or 6 days ago. And I found out, this one's embarrassing, talk about recent cringe moments, not in training, that there's actually a pretty like strong recommendation to avoid antibiotics in mild to moderate diverticulitis. And you're nodding because you knew this and I did not. I love it because, look, increasingly antibiotics were thrown at everything for so long, for everything, for any inflammation or anything, the body was requiring. And so I was happy to see that that was taken away. I had a septic patient. I was trying to figure out where the line was before antibiotics in diverticulitis, but I was happy to read the increasing resistance to just throwing ciproflagyl at every episode of diverticulitis. I think that's going to be great for patients.
Yeah, and I will say this is where inpatient and outpatient have different flavors because my understanding is the evidence also has a similar conclusion, obviously, in the outpatient world. However, when you're inpatient and you're sick as a patient and you're monitored 24/7 and you for sure someone's going to help you, be there in case something goes south. In the outpatient world, trying to describe someone who's come to your clinic and has diverticulitis, like, hey, you'll need antibiotics. I think it's healthy. I try to have those conversations as open and honestly as I can with the patients, but it's a little bit harder to have that. Yeah.
Considerably harder. I mean, we could talk about pneumonia for the rest of the hour, right? And like, what are the indications for antibiotic treatment in adults and in children? And then what are the patient-sided effects, right? When they feel like garbage, they're stressed, they can't breathe, like all of these things, just like diverticulitis. Yeah.
What do you think, going back to up to date, what do you think your most read article has been since you've been a subscriber?
I'm going to keep on the cringe theme here. Amoxicillin dosing. It is. I use up to date for their like a lot of their drug like prescriber recommendations, and amoxicillin dosing between pediatrics and adults has never stayed in my brain, no matter how hard I've tried. I don't feel good about that. So that is absolutely my most read article.
That is okay. That's why you have a resource and you use it. As a medical ethicist, what do you think the most important development in medical ethics has been in recent memory?
So I think one of the most important recent developments in medical ethics is the socialization and elevation of medical ethics as a core competency to be taught in medical schools. I think you and I were taught it. I don't know about you. Were you guys taught that in Tennessee?
Yes, I don't think it was like a separate course, but it was just kind of woven in. Maybe that's what you're getting at.
Well, it was, but so it was not a requirement just a couple years before we went to medical school. You and I think, started the same year and ended like roughly on the same path. Just a few years before us, it was not at all a part of medical education. It was supplemental education that you could take on if you were so interested. And so, yeah, when I was in medical school, I took it to answer the questions on step one. That was my only goal, was to get through and was to survive the next step in training. But what it meant is now you've got an entire generation of doctors where everybody has a shared language to communicate about these things. And so as a result, people aren't afraid to call the ethics board because you can have the conversation. You have the language. You're an informed consumer of this service, of the ethics service. So you can have conversations about ethics with patients, with families, with other providers, with members of the ethics board. And it's not seen as this potentially punitive, punitive board that will take your license or hurt you or harm you. It's seen as a patient advocate and patient support network that you can tap into as a provider. And I think that's a really important thing. That even just by educating everybody, even if it's not a targeted focus, like you're saying, we can all speak the language of it, and that immediately changes the practice of medicine and the engagement with ethics.
So, not having a set class or separate class during your medical school experience, how did you come about trying to gain an interest and get more experience in medical ethics?
I stumbled into it, like so many things in my career. Like I mentioned earlier, I stumbled into it. I was not particularly interested in med school. Like I said, I just wanted to answer the questions. It just was a thing to get through. I didn't get it. And then I got an experience in residency where somebody said, "Hey, like, why don't you just come down? You can sit in on the meetings of the ethics committee as residents. You're allowed to sit in." And so I sat in and heard the conversations that were being had about how to support, about fascinating conversations that were happening that impacted our ability to practice medicine. It was about drug rationing, IV fluid rationing. How do we divvy up resources, not just within the hospital, but divide up resources in the region? You and I trained at the University of Cincinnati, like the major training institution in the region, but there were six other major hospitals in the city. So how do we make sure that Cincinnati gets theirs, but doesn't take from everybody else, creating shortages and scarcity and stuff like that? And so that was the first night. I'll always remember it because it immediately opened my eyes to a different way that that the practice of medicine exists, and it's at the systems level, and it's how do we get all the way from this top tier. If you get a box of drugs, this other hospital doesn't get it. There's scarcity at every level, and then how does that flow down all the way to patient interventions? And so, I would invite everybody. So many ethics committees that I've worked at different institutions have spaces specifically for residents and trainees. It's really, and even for medical students. And so, just raising your hand and saying, "Hey, like, I'd love to come down and sit in and audit a meeting," and it's what got me, and really, honestly, frankly, kind of changed a lot of what my non-clinical practice has been. Even when we were residents, I then joined the residency committee and was on it for the rest of our time in residency. It was absolutely value add for my training.
Very cool.
Oh yeah, ethics is the coolest.
Well, no, I'm saying it's a cool opportunity. I didn't realize you could do that as a resident, but I think your message to the trainees out there of, hey, look into this and kind of be assertive at trying to get experience, and it might open a lot of doors and eyes to a deeper understanding of the system.
I think residency more than anything, this is not a question you asked, but I think residency more than anything, I learned more about the diverse ways in which medicine is practiced. And now, nearly 10 years out of residency, like looking back, I learned more during that 4-year period than I did at any other stage. Being out and as a practicing attending, we talk about this all the time. You're almost like isolated more on an island. And so taking opportunities in residency where you're given them, right, where you get invited to try out new services and new practices, new committees at the hospital, it really is a great time to learn so much more broadly about how healthcare is delivered. I miss it a lot. There's a lot of a lot about residency I don't miss, but being able to see and experience so many different areas of the hospital is pretty incredible. I don't know where imaging is in the hospital I work at right now. No clue. Couldn't tell you. Don't know what floor it's on. Couldn't tell you. We knew in Cincinnati, though, right? You got called there. You might have to go to a code there. You might respond to a procedure. You might be in a procedure there doing the procedure. Couldn't even tell you what floor it's on in Boston. Not a clue.
Interesting. Well, let me ask you this. If you had ultimate authority, how would you go about fixing the student debt issue that doctors face?
Okay, I'm going to go with a non-traditional answer here. Actually, it's probably an incredibly traditional answer here. I like a service model where a couple years of general practice service before residency pays your loans back. And that there's a couple different ways to do it, but there are models that exist elsewhere and even models that have been practiced and piloted in the US where we know there's a general practice shortage around the country, especially in a lot of rural areas and underserved areas, that for a couple years of that type of practice, your loans are forgiven, and then you go start your specialty training. Whether that specialty training is med peds or orthopedic surgery or whatever else you want to go into, you then start with a couple years of practice, of independent practice, far more confidence and understanding about how medicine is actually delivered, and you've given back to the country that helped train and educate you by going and serving in a rural or underserved area. And also, if you don't want to do that, then you just pay your loans back. Like, it seems like a fair trade. You know, you're not required to do it, but if you don't want to, then you just put your loans on a 20-year repayment plan and try to pay them back when you can. But it's a model that I like very much, of service for tuition. I think it's a reasonable model that's worked in other places, and we do today. The Montgomery GI Bill for service members who serve in the military. We do a great job with it, but we haven't extended it to medicine or to other kind of like, social services or public services.
Very interesting. What is and well, before I ask this question, I think that is, I like the idea as a theory. Again, in the question, you were given ultimate authority, but obviously you have so many other interest groups that would not like that for many reasons.
If you gave me ultimate authority, I would Harry Potter wand away $1.8 trillion, reset everybody, and but honestly, there's so many second, third, and fourth order effects. I'm not smart enough to understand what that would do. It would create a ton of harm. I was trying to have ultimate authority and create something that might have some good. It would fail I'm sure, for people undercutting it and saying, let's see, those doctors aren't trained. How dare you let them practice on me? You'd have to be graduating medical students who could practice independently or within a very tightly subscribed scope. We're not really set up for that either, from a liability standpoint. The first time you miss a prescription in your first year, were you wrong or were you undertrained? I've been wrong. I've also been undertrained. It's really tough to tell where that level is. So,
what is one opinion you hold now that the med student version of you would find upsetting?
My joke answer is that doctors are overpaid. That would be my joke.
That is a bad joke. Bad joke.
I think when I was a med student, I thought the doctors were far more important in the ultimate healthcare delivery and success or outcome of a patient. I now recognize not just that it takes a village, it takes an entire healthcare system. And that frankly, as a doctor, I spend some of the least time at bedside. And so it could be a good decision or the right idea or a good treatment plan, but there are, on any given inpatient stay, 20 other people on a given day who are actually overseeing and are the output of your plan. And so in many ways, they're frankly far more important. I could know the right IV antibiotic, but I don't know how to give it still today. Like I don't know what I'm doing. And so I find myself far less important, and I like it. I like the team mentality. I like that it takes all of us. I like working together on it.
Which medical educator has made the biggest impact on your clinical career, and which one the biggest impact on your non-clinical aspects of your career?
Medical educator on my clinical career. I mean, honestly, medical educator on my clinical career is Dr. Caroline Mueller. Cincinnati. This isn't a bit here, Caroline. I don't know if you listen to us, but two of your former alumni and graduates. Going to Cincinnati was probably one of the most important things in my clinical career. The other options that I had on my match list were not nearly as strong of institutions, and so going to Cincinnati, everything else that Cincinnati brought in terms of my clinical abilities and what I was able to learn, and then ultimately able to go on into fellowship and then into attending practice, that trajectory would not have been without a major influence from Caroline Mueller, not just accepting me into the residency program, but then continuing to shepherd me along and act in some ways as a mentor, as our program director in Med Peds. It was a surprise for me that I was able to get into a Cincinnati and that she took a chance on me. Yeah, non-clinically,
Non-clinical, yeah.
I don't know non-clinical. My non-clinical practice.
Yeah, just, you mean, you talked about medical ethics, you work in global health, you do policy work, these types of things. Is there somebody that has mentored you kind of in your non-clinical skill set that's made an impact?
I think following on, it's from the same path. But even before I started in Boston in fellowship, Michelle Nishrenko, who's the program director for Global Health and Populations program in Boston, was somebody who I'd known of, somebody whom is a titan in international health delivery. And so again, it was another opportunity of taking opportunities at every chance to learn from people way smarter than me and better than me. And she is both of those things. And so learning from her about, a lot of global health is non-clinical practice. It's some of it's clinical, diseases you haven't seen, treatments you've never tried before. But a lot of it is, what is the system? What do we do in austere environments? What do we do if the power doesn't work or the water doesn't work? Or even if just this is a system that we've never used before. And so it asks a lot of questions that chip away at the heart of what is healthcare delivery? Some people might still consider that clinical. I don't know. I don't. I think it is, how we deliver healthcare is very different than the what, and so that's what I like about it.
What amount of money would it take for you to go back to being a bicycle cab driver?
Is that from ChatGPT? Did ChatGPT find my?
ChatGPT, yeah, it read your bio, told me that.
I have an expired taxi cab license in the great state of Massachusetts. You have to be licensed. I mean, come on, these weren't anarchists. How much money would it take? It'd be a great retirement career. I would gladly do it again if I had enough money to live comfortably on Cape Cod.
I wonder why I don't see a lot of retirees operating those bikes. I wonder if it has something to do with maybe aging and osteoarthritis, but I'm not positive on that. It might not be the easiest career on your body.
The bike I had a little tiny motor on it for assist. Those little tiny
Oh,
electric motors are only getting better. That was 20 years ago. I'm sure we've got better modes for it now. Um, Also, kind of depends on the size of the average American who's riding in the back of your bicycle. So it's a little bit of
yeah.
a race. Well, it's a race from the obesity epidemic against the rise of electric motors, and so important to we'll see who wins.
An interesting battle that I don't think I have thought about. But thank you, Dr. Palmer. I know we're wrapping up. You're a busy man, but I wanted to end on our question we always ask, which is, what is one thing that you have changed your mind about recently?
I knew you were going to ask me this question. I still am not prepared for it. I've known for a couple of weeks, unlike the rest of our guests, Mark Cuban included, who was very blown away and taken by this question. I'm still not prepared for it. So, what is one thing that I've changed my mind about recently?
It's okay. This is great. Stumped him. For those of you listening at home, I stumped him.
Almost speechless, which is even harder to do.
You can just say you never change your mind.
Yeah, I'm pretty firm in my old age. I've just decided to stop changing my mind. Okay, I will say this on a personal note. We are taking this call about 8 weeks before the birth of my first child, mine and my partner's first child. Our first a son is what we've
Congratulations.
grown to expect. Thank you, Dr. Jerkins. And as you, Dr. Jerkins, know for many years, if I've considered myself fairly independent and able to do and handle things on my own. I think even in the run up to and in the advance of this, I am immediately finding out how wrong I was, and that it absolutely probably does not take a village every single time, but it is so much more helpful to have a support network and groups of people around and everybody else well in advance of the child actually being here. It is it's kind of amazing in one way, and I'm very lucky, and my partner and I are very lucky and blessed to go through this with support networks around us. But I now, in retrospect, even over the last couple of weeks, cannot imagine what it would be like without and how challenging that is. So I have very much changed my mind. I thought I could do it. I was like, I can do anything. Come on, that's fine. Wrong. Dead wrong.
Well, it's a humbling experience, Dr. Palmer. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you all for joining us for another episode of the podcast For Doctors by Doctors. We do actually have an email. I forgot to mention this at the top, but we do have an email. If you have questions for us or questions for a guest or a potential guest you think would be interesting to have on the show, you can email us at podcast@panaceafinancial.com. Is that right, Ned? That's the email?
It is. Yeah.
I appreciate it, and we'll see you in the next episode. Thanks for joining us this episode, and you can catch the podcast For Doctors by Doctors on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and all the other major podcasting platforms. If you enjoyed this episode or learned anything here today, please take a moment to give us a rating and subscribe so that you don't miss a single episode release. To submit topic suggestions or guest suggestions or questions, you can reach us at podcast@panaceafinancial.com. As always, thanks for listening, and the next time you see a doctor, maybe you should prescribe them this podcast. See you next time.